Hello there and welcome to my channel. I've had this channel on YouTube for a few years now, but I haven't posted much on it except for a couple of videos. My goal for the next few months is to post something on a more regular basis. If you haven't subscribed as of yet, please do so right now. Now, I am most active on two social media platforms at the moment. The first would be my Twitter account, and the second is my Quora account. And Quora, www.quora.com, Quora being spelled Q-U-O-R-A, is a question and answer site which is of great interest to people. I will put the links for those down below. I post a few articles and random thoughts about things, mainly related to politics and things of personal interest, on my Twitter and Quora accounts. I am also a graphic designer, and I will place the link to my design website down below if you are also so interested. I have a blog, also, which is called The Story of Michael. Now, I started this a few years back as a way to chronicle some very tough personal times I was going through, and for the past few years I have neglected it somewhat, but I've decided in recent weeks to dust it off a little bit and post new content. I will post a link to that below as well. I am told that because of the rising popularity of YouTube, that I really need to have a YouTube presence also, so that's why I'm here, and you'll be seeing more of me as the weeks and months go by. Actually, you'll be hearing more of me first, as right now I'm a little bit more comfortable providing audio content right now, before I work up the courage to go on camera. Now, here's what I would like to discuss today. America still needs a strong Amtrak. The case for an Amtrak Trust Fund. I wrote this as the latest post on my Story of Michael blog, and I'll provide the link down below to that as well. Amtrak is America's nationwide passenger rail system. It has been operating since 1971, when it took over service from the freight railroads, who lost interest in operating a national passenger rail network after World War II in the face of increased competition from the new interstate highways and the rapidly modernizing commercial aviation infrastructure. Amtrak was the culmination of several years of arguing back and forth between the freight railroads and the federal government over the need to have a national passenger rail network at all. As the 1950s and 60s progressed, it became less and less profitable for the freight railroads to survive financially under a federal mandate to provide passenger service. The freight railroads wanted the government to relieve them of that responsibility in order to stay in business and continue moving their freight, and thus Amtrak was created. Amtrak has had its ups and downs over the course of the past few decades. Amtrak depends on federal funding to operate and survive, and in today's polarized political climate, Amtrak seems to have fewer and fewer friends in Washington to defend and protect it. I am of the opinion that Amtrak needs to be strengthened, not weakened. Amtrak has been under a mandate to be, or at least as much as possible, completely and totally self-sufficient by means of revenue from passenger fares and other sources. Now, while Amtrak certainly does earn a great deal of revenue from passenger fares, such a mandate is completely and totally unrealistic and unfair, in my opinion. When transportation systems, be they motor coach or commercial aviation, are left to fend for themselves to be profitable, the first thing that happens is that they shut down and cease or at least scale back on operations if they are not profitable. For example, if Southwest Airlines tries to increase service from Tucson International Airport, which is a secondary airport to Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport, and no one flies on the planes, then Southwest will, and must, as part of its fiduciary responsibility, cancel some or even all of those departures, in a drastic situation, in the name of profitability for the entire Southwest Airlines system. Amtrak, in my opinion, is too important to a balanced national transportation system to be left to its own devices and to try and simply be self-sufficient when it's really not possible for that to happen. Amtrak is too important to be canceled, even if it is a money-losing system. America needs a balanced national transportation system that connects all parts of the country together. Such a system consists of our interstate highways, and that means our trucks, cars, and motor coaches such as Greyhound and other providers, commercial aviation and the major airlines, our maritime system including container shipping, commuter ferries in some of our major cities, and the cruise lines, and our railroads including the freight railroads and Amtrak. Now, not every cross-country traveler wants to fly. Some don't like the hassle of going through security and having to put up with any number of delays and disruptions. Not every cross-country traveler wants to drive and put up with the fatigue and possible danger of driving long distances and having to stop for food and an overnight hotel stay. And there are some travelers who refuse to even board a Greyhound bus because of the stigma of Greyhound being basically a low-cost mode of travel heavily used by low-income people, and to a lesser extent, younger passengers such as college and university students who many times are on tight budgets themselves. Passengers must be allowed to have a choice in their mode of long-distance travel in this nation. Amtrak needs to remain active, viable, and healthy as a pleasant and hassle-free alternative to commercial aviation and other forms of long-distance travel, as I so noted. Here's what I want. Number 1. Keep the long-haul transcontinental routes going. Amtrak has a few of these, including the Sunset Limited, which travels between Los Angeles and New Orleans, the Empire Builder from Seattle to Chicago, the California Zephyr from Oakland to Chicago, the Southwest Chief from Los Angeles to Chicago, and one or two others. When traveling longer than 100 miles, Amtrak is significantly more convenient and a more pleasant traveling experience than taking a Greyhound bus or driving for 6 hours in your car on the highway or flying and having to deal with delays and airport security. Number 2, keep and improve Amtrak's short-haul routes. Not the transcontinental routes, but routes that operate within a state that feed within the network to connect travelers to the longer haul routes. Funding for many of them has been assumed over the years by the various states in which they operate. And I feel that while that's a nice thing, funding needs to be primarily of a federal nature, with state funding strictly as a supplement. Some states have moved to privatization, or at least experimented with privatization as the answer. Sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't, as was proven with the state of Indiana, which briefly tried to outsource the onboard operations of its short-haul train, or one of its short-haul trains, the Hoosier State, to private operators. It sort of worked for a while, but Amtrak eventually had to take the route back over. You can also feed into your short-haul routes and your long-haul transcontinental routes with dedicated Amtrak Thruway coaches. Amtrak has a network of feeder buses and sometimes shuttle vans and taxicabs known as the Amtrak Thruway system. Nationwide, I believe that this Thruway system needs to be revamped and structured more to the way that it is in the state of California, which provides significant state funding for it, with dedicated motor coaches, actual motor coach buses that have the Amtrak Thruway branding on the vehicles, and they use exclusively Amtrak designated stations and stops, and you purchase tickets for these exclusively through Amtrak as part of your ticketing for your train. And if Amtrak would do this nationwide, I think that would be a significant help to the entire national network and provide a better experience for the passenger. And speaking of the experience for the passenger, you keep the passenger onboard experience as awesome as possible. The Amtrak onboard experience is very special, quite unique, and a major selling point and attraction to passengers. Amtrak's national advertising on television, radio, and magazines always features happy, smiling passengers enjoying looking outside the big picture windows and eating the food in the dining car. The onboard experience is something that should not be cut back on or treated lightly. You need to keep making the experience, or Amtrak does, I should say, keeping that experience, even in your basic coach service, better than the airlines. Amtrak seats are known for being wider and having significantly more leg room than the airlines. Keep that happening. You also should provide complimentary snacks, juices, and soft drinks, even in standard coach. Right now, complimentary juices and soft drinks and complimentary coffee are offered for your sleeping car passengers, and the sleeping cars are basically your first-class accommodations on Amtrak. All coach passengers, as well as your sleeping car passengers, should also receive a basic amenity kit similar to what the airlines provide in first class and business class, with basic toiletries and hygiene items so that passengers can at least brush their teeth or wash their face or apply deodorant while they're on a 48 to 72 hour trip across country. Now, amenities such as dining car service, which currently are included in the cost of the ticket for sleeping car passengers, is currently being threatened with cutbacks and outright elimination. On 2 long-distance routes in the Northeast, the Capital Limited and the Lakeshore Limited, these dining cars have been completely eliminated and put in their place. Amtrak will be offering, and this is effective this summer, what they're calling hot and cold contemporary and fresh dining choices for sleeping car customers. Basically, these are airline-style, prepared, packaged breakfast, lunch, and dinner options from what I understand. And I'll read a little bit from the service alert that they put out. And this is in place of traditional dining car service aboard the Capital Limited and the Lakeshore Limited, effective July 11th. So this has already been implemented. Meals will be ordered, I'm quoting here, meals will be ordered with the sleeping car attendants and delivered to sleeping car passengers through enhanced room service. Sleeping car customers will choose from a variety of quality, fresh, and ready-to-serve meals. Sleeping car passengers have the option to dine at available seating in the sleeping car lounge or can continue to be served in their bedrooms or roomettes. Meals will continue to be included in the sleeping car fare. The tables in both the sleeping car lounge and cafe lounge cars will be on a first-come basis for seating, but there will be no at-table dining service. And I guess to soften the blow of this, Amtrak goes on to say, and I quote, "Sleeping car passengers on all Amtrak trains are offered complimentary morning coffee, chilled water and juices, in-room meal service, turn-down service for their beds, private restrooms and shower facilities. Also provided are pre-boarding privileges and same-day access to lounges, such as Club Acela in the Northeast Corridor and the Metropolitan Lounge in Chicago." They do go on to state that the existing a la carte cafe and lounge car menu will continue unchanged. The options in the cafe and lounge car are basically prepared sandwiches, hot dogs, potato chips, pastries, cookies, soft drinks, snacks, juices, and things of that nature, somewhat like a convenience store. Now, I am all for efficiency, but one of the traditional components of rail travel, as I mentioned, alluded to a moment ago, has always been the dining car. Eliminating this tradition for enhanced room service and contemporary dining choices, which, again, is reminiscent of airline service, is, in my opinion, an ill-advised move for Amtrak, and from what I'm reading on the internet, has already begun to turn off some passengers. Now, where I would welcome this new service, these prepared meals would be as a complimentary offering for passengers traveling in your basic standard coach service, and that would keep the cost of meals down for those travelers and reduce their expenses in the cafe and lounge car. Another way that Amtrak can keep the experience at the highest possible level is to continue to invest, as they have been doing, in new rolling stock, that would be the passenger cars, and the maintenance and upgrades of the trackage and right-of-way that Amtrak controls, and the different Amtrak stations and depots that they operate. You may ask, how can we still maintain Amtrak if it's so important to the national transportation system overall? What will it take? Well, simply put, it will take money, and more of it. And that money needs to be mainly public money with a bit of private money from the very freight railroads that dropped passenger service like a sack of hot potatoes many decades earlier. Now hear me out for a moment. In my opinion, Amtrak is not funded fairly in the manner that the interstate highway system, or America's airports, or even our public bus, light rail, and subway systems in our cities are funded. It makes no sense, zero sense to me, that commercial aviation gets millions and even billions of dollars in a government-mandated trust fund that actually has a surplus, while Amtrak struggles to survive. First off, I believe that the long-haul transcontinental routes need to be seen as necessary loss leaders. They should be allowed to freely operate without any regard to profitability. They should be absolutely the flagship trains of Amtrak and provide the maximum amount of comfort and value to the passenger, even at a loss. And while I like the fact that states are willing to pitch in and do their part to fund Amtrak service that benefits the people of their state, certainly to help with their local economies, their regional economies, and with tourism, which is certainly a very big part of the economies of most of our states around the country, let's keep in mind that Amtrak is a national system. The primary source of funding sufficient for the entire nationwide passenger rail system should be federally based. Here's an idea. You can raise the federal motor fuel and aviation taxes by 1 penny each and create a dedicated national Amtrak Trust Fund. This Amtrak Trust Fund would be similar to the highway, mass transit, and aviation trust funds. This would be a dedicated source of at least partial funding for the Amtrak national system, independent of the general fund and independent of support from the various states. The Amtrak Fund should earn a moderate interest on the funds on account. This Amtrak Trust Fund would primarily support your day-to-day operation of all passenger service, including your traditional dining car service, coach service, sleeping car service, reducing the burden on the states to provide funding for shorter routes, with a strong secondary focus on basic maintenance and upkeep of rolling stock, trackage, and right-of-way owned directly by Amtrak, and your station and depot infrastructure. I would imagine that your major capital improvement projects would still need to be funded on an individual basis through the appropriations process, as has been the case before. And apparently I'm not alone in thinking this. From doing my research for the blog post, I discovered that Congress came close to establishing a trust fund for Amtrak back in 1997, and there was a Senate version of the 1997 tax reconciliation bill that would have created this rail fund, supported by a half-cent of the existing gasoline and diesel taxes, as I'm looking here. But the House killed that provision in conference, and we have never heard of such a proposal again. In fiscal year 2014, the federal gas tax raised $35 billion, dedicating just 2% of that to a dedicated Amtrak Trust Fund would provide $700 million. In fiscal year 2015, the federal aviation fuel tax raised about $14 billion. Dedicating just 1.5% of that to a dedicated Amtrak Trust Fund would raise $210 million. That is a combined $910 million as a dedicated funding source for Amtrak, at least on a supplemental basis, irrespective of any other federal grants or revenue from passenger fares. Now, I wouldn't mind even paying an extra $1 per ticket as an Amtrak passenger to help pitch into this Amtrak Trust Fund. Amtrak earned $3.2 billion in fiscal year 2017 in passenger fare revenue. That's a record. On over 31 million passenger trips. That's a record. So, if we assume that one passenger trip equals one ticket, naturally a $1 ticket surtax could bring in as much as $31 million. Now, we're talking with this money about $1 billion, which is a pretty good chunk of change for a dedicated source of revenue. But I'd like to go a little bit further. I believe that the big Class 1 freight railroads and even the Class 2 railroads should contribute more towards Amtrak. This idea, while I think is perfectly fair, is sure to draw much criticism and opposition. Yes, I know that Amtrak was created to take the burden of passenger service off of these carriers. However, what is clear, from the best of my knowledge anyway, and from my research, the freight railroads seem to be doing just fine. They seem to be quite profitable. And as the designated host railroads to Amtrak, they are critical to Amtrak's success. The freight railroads need to step up and live up to their responsibility as partners in Amtrak and our national passenger rail network. Burlington Northern Santa Fe alone reported $21 billion in revenues in fiscal year 2017. BNSF, which actually owns 35% of Amtrak's common stock, should pay, in my opinion, 1% of that revenue into the Amtrak Trust Fund. Now, 1% is not very much to ask, but it would provide an annual infusion, and give or take a little bit, taking into account fluctuations in revenue year over year, that would be in the neighborhood of $210 million. Now, to account for contributions, at least from a hypothetical basis, from Union Pacific, Kansas City Southern, CSX Transportation, and Norfolk Southern, the other Class 1 major railroads, the freight railroads, and even maybe subtracting about $300 million, let's say, to account for slightly lower operating revenues from Kansas City Southern, CSX, and Norfolk Southern, and let's add $50 million as a combined contribution from all of the maybe about 15 or so Class 2 railroads, except for those Class 2 railroads that are operated through a governmental agency, or in the case of the Long Island Railroad, which is actually a part of the New York City transportation subway system. Let's take those out of it, but those that operate as freight railroads would put in some contribution to that in the tune of $50 million. All of this together would give us about $590 million. Now, the Aviation Trust Fund gets a portion of its revenue from a 6.25% surcharge on all air cargo. I think a 1% federally mandated surcharge on all Class 1 and Class 2 freight cargo, and this would be payable directly and exclusively by the shippers themselves, I think would be a fair way to supplement the Amtrak Trust Fund. In fiscal year 2016, the total revenue for Burlington Northern Santa Fe, just from freight alone, was nearly $19 billion. 1% of that, of course, would make $190 million. Added to that $590 million number, we arrive at $780 million. Now, mind you, for this surcharge, I am not counting the contributions from the other Class 1, Class 2 railroads, just BNSF alone. Added to the $910 million, This gives us a minimum of well over $1.5 billion, $1,610,000,000 in dedicated annual revenue, and again, taking into account annual fluctuations year over year. This would be a very, very nice chunk of change to keep Amtrak healthy and strong. Amtrak has consistently received about $1 billion most years of its history in the form of direct appropriations from Congress, but in some years only as low as $600 million. With a dedicated trust fund where it can be relied on somewhat, supplied through minor increases in the motor fuel and aviation fuel taxes, contributions from the freight railroads, including a surcharge on freight, it could be possible for Congress, and even some of the individual states that are subsidizing Amtrak service, to actually reduce the appropriations that they are giving each year. Now, this is keeping in mind that according to the FAA, at the beginning of fiscal year 2018, the Aviation Trust Fund had a cash balance of about $15 billion. The Highway Trust Fund had a cash balance of about $37 billion. Now, I don't think $1 to $1.5 billion in dedicated annual revenue is too much to ask in light of that to keep America's passenger rail network strong. Here's a compromise I could accept. If the freight railroads so oppose my proposition, perhaps the freight railroads could provide fewer funds to the trust fund in exchange for taking their own initiative and making their own capital improvements to their own trackage and right-of-way. That would be beneficial to both Amtrak and the freight railroads. Double tracking or adding sidings to sections that are currently single track, for example. This would help Amtrak immensely. There would be fewer delays, especially on your long-haul western routes, such as the Southwest Chief or the Empire Builder, which sometimes are burdened by delays due to freight traffic. The freight railroads are supposed to prioritize Amtrak traffic, but in practice this happens on a haphazard basis, to the chagrin and annoyance of Amtrak, so much so that from what I've read, Amtrak actually wants the authority to file legal action against these freight railroads to force them to do what they're supposed to do and cooperate. My compromise would severely reduce the need for this legal action. So the bottom line, America needs a balanced transportation system, one in which the American long-distance passenger has a true choice in how he or she travels. Amtrak is a huge and important part of such a balanced system, and must not only be protected, but made as strong and healthy as possible. A dedicated revenue source via a reliable Amtrak Trust Fund is a great starting point. The question is, will our elected officials listen?